about it.
Actually, about a year ago, Bob Herbert asked a question in a column in the New York Times. They opened the column up, which was about torture, with the question, does America have a conscience? And that question, when I read it, really resonated with me. And it's a question that I think organized my activity as an activist before I even read it in that column. But in meeting Ann Wright, which who I met in 2004, I think it was, in Crawford, Texas, and getting to know her, it made me realize that yes, America does have a conscience, and that is what you'll hear tonight in terms of the people that Ann has written about in this book, and in getting to know Ann through what she has to tell you tonight. So please welcome Ann Wright.
Well, can everybody see okay, or should I stand up? I've got a little sciatica, so it may not.
So you're going to do both, right?
I made. Maybe if you can't see, maybe we can move another chair right up in here if that's okay. And here's one right here if you want to. It's a real pleasure to be here in Park Slope, Brooklyn, right here at this wonderful, wonderful bookstore that I understand does so much for the community bookstore. And going around the country talking about this new book, Dissent Voices of Conscience, we're trying to go to the independent bookstores, because those are the ones that, have been, they've been part of our communities all over the country for years and years and years. And we want to keep them in business just with the onslaught of the huge, huge bookstores that are around now. So I thank you all so much for being here on a very cold, well, not maybe so cold, but gosh, a very difficult evening after all the snow and the rain. And I thank you very, very much for braving the elements to come out here. And I'm amazed that you all are here. Well, my name is Ann Wright, and I am a 29-year veteran of the U.S. military. 13 years on active duty and 16 years in the reserve component. I was also a U.S. diplomat for 16 years. And I served in places like Grenada, Nicaragua, Somalia, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Sierra Leone, Micronesia. I helped reopen the embassy in Kabul, Afghanistan in December of 2001 and stayed there for about 5 months. And then my last assignment was in Mongolia. And I was the deputy ambassador of the U.S. Embassy in Mongolia and Afghanistan and Micronesia and Sierra Leone. So I'd been, that's good dogs, good puppy dogs for peace.
Definitely. Heart of gold.
I had been the deputy ambassador in 4 different embassies, so I'd risen to a reasonable height in the system of the State Department. As the rhetoric of the Bush administration started getting more militant and belligerent about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and the dangers that these weapons of mass destruction presented to the rest of the United States and the rest of the world, I was feeling very uneasy about that, although I didn't have any more information about weapons of mass destruction than the average citizen did, because the State Department wasn't giving us any particular special information about it. We were just reading the same press releases that you all were. I was wondering why this big rush to war in Iraq, particularly coming from out of Afghanistan, where if one believed that the United States should send its military and CIA in to go after Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan versus maybe a law enforcement response to the threats coming out of Al-Qaeda. If you believe we needed to be in Afghanistan with the military and CIA, then why didn't we send a lot of them in there to really go after them? But we had sent just really a very few number of U.S. military troops, to the extent that while I was in Afghanistan, the Afghans in most of the major cities were saying, we need help. We need help on security from the warlords that you've hired on one level to help you push the Taliban out and to go after Al-Qaeda. But these are the same guys that raped, pillaged, and plundered after they defeated the Soviets, and they're doing the same thing again. And you need to send in more people into the cities to help us fend off these guys. Well, Washington wasn't sending any more troops in, nor were they sending economic development specialists in the numbers and the quickness that were needed, in my opinion, for us to really start helping the Afghan people with schools, health clinics, all those things that traditionally one does when one goes into a country. And certainly the United States does have a reputation of going into lots of countries. I myself had, in the military, had been into Grenada and Panama as a part of U.S. Interventions in those two countries. So I was wondering why the Bush administration was so intent on going into a totally different country, that really had nothing to do with 9/11, and why they were going to expend the resources there. And I guess the State of the Union message that Bush did in February or January of 2002, where he said there are other countries of interest besides just Afghanistan, that Iran, Iraq, North Korea, the axis of evil, those were other countries. And we had, sitting in Afghanistan, kind of went, oh my God, here we go again. There's something else afoot, although we didn't know it at that point in early 2002 what they were already cooking up. But as the drumbeat to war kept getting stronger and stronger and stronger all through 2002, and by the time I got to Mongolia in August of 2002, there was a definite feel that the United States was going to go to war. And then by the fall, the administration had, what do you want to term it, had convinced, had buffaloed, had lied to the Congress, or the Congress was not suspicious, was not asking the right questions. I mean, here was the complicity of the Congress going along with an executive decision on an authorization for the use of force in October of 2002. And then by 2003, in February, that's when Colin Powell gave the big presentation to the UN Security Council about the weapons of mass destruction and how they were there, and here's all the evidence about them. And yet he was unable to convince the UN Security Council that those weapons were there, and the UN did not vote for military operations in Iraq. Well, I was very, very disturbed about what appeared to be the decision of the Bush administration to invade and occupy an oil-rich Arab Muslim, oil-rich, I did say that, Arab Muslim country that had not attacked the United States. And without that UN Security Council authorization, I felt it was illegal. And so I was one of 3 U.S. diplomats that resigned in opposition to the war in Iraq. I decided I could not put up with that. The first person that resigned was Brady Kiesling, who was our political counselor in our embassy in Greece. And then the second one was John Brown, who was on a special assignment with Georgetown University. And then I was out in Mongolia. And we were the only 3 people from the federal government that resigned. That's in contrast to the British government. They had 4 times as many government employees resign as we did in our government. And that's kind of stunning, isn't it? Because it's a much smaller government. And the decision of the Blair administration to go along with the Bush decision to go to war really deeply affected government employees there. because many of those government employees had already made their decision that the participation of the British was going to be a war crime, that to commit an act of aggression on a country that had not done anything to you is a war crime. It's a violation of the peace of the world. And in fact, some of the government employees had written, well, not some, but virtually all of the legal specialists in the various departments of the British government had made legal opinions, had given legal opinions since 2002 that for the British to participate in this war with the United States would be an illegal act on the part of their government, and any government official that ordered that would be liable to be hauled before the International Criminal Court. And those legal opinions were given to Tony Blair. I mean, the Attorney General of the UK, Lord Goldsmith, had consistently told Blair that. The Deputy Legal Counsel of their equivalent of the State Department, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, had told him that. A woman by the name of Elizabeth Willemshurst, who actually resigned just about the same time I did. And we didn't find out about her resignation for a year. That she kept her resignation private, and the British government definitely didn't want it to be coming out that, as it turned out, in her letter of resignation, she specifically said that British government participation in an invasion of Iraq would be an act of aggression, would be a war crime, and government officials would be criminally liable for it. So, and she also just had a little P.S., and the British Attorney General has had the same opinion until right before the war started, when somehow he changed his mind after giving legal opinion for months and months and months that it would be illegal. All of a sudden his arm was twisted. There were some very senior people in the British government that resigned. The former Secretary of Foreign Affairs for the British government under Tony Blair in his first administration, Robin Cook, who then was the leader of one of the Houses of Parliament, the House of Commons. He, as a senior member of that government, resigned. And his resignation speech to the Parliament, my understanding is it's the only time in the 700-year history of the Parliament that there's been a standing ovation.
Wow.
Yeah. It would have been a different thing had we had some resignations of some senior people in our government, wouldn't it? I mean, the three of us, we were mid-level career officials of the State Department, and our resignations really didn't do much. They got a little publicity, and it gave heart to people that there were people within the government that said we should not be doing this. And in fact, there were after I resigned, but was still in Mongolia, I received emails from over 400 of my colleagues in the State Department, in embassies throughout the world, saying this decision of the administration to invade and occupy Iraq is a complete disaster. I mean, it's the level of dislike, if not hatred, of the United States is just skyrocketing. And from friends that were in the Middle East, they were saying, of course, the men and women of the country where I'm living they hate the United States, and they will be the ones that will be recruited to take action against us. That they will probably come to Iraq and get trained to fight the infidels. That's us. To get the United States out of this Arab Muslim country. And indeed, we've seen that has happened. There have been a lot of young people coming in from the region to help the Iraqis push out the invader. There were other people in our government, though, that were speaking out. They didn't resign, but they did speak out. Here's a question for you: how did the people that actually flew the planes into the various buildings, the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, and the plane that went into the earth in Pennsylvania, how did they get into the United States?
Legally.
Illegally?
Quite legally.
Quite legally, yeah, quite legally. The consulates in Saudi Arabia gave them visas. Now, I've been a consular officer myself, and I know that before you can issue a visa for a person to come to the United States, you have to do a name check on them. You have to run their name through a database that the State Department maintains in Washington, and it has to come back clear that the person doesn't have anything like, well, we think he might be doing nefarious things. He might be on a list of terrorists or something like that. So how did they get in there? Have you ever heard, were people suspicious about these guys?
A lot of them were student visas.
A lot of student visas, yeah. But do you think that maybe there was some information within our government that had been accumulated that might have led consular officers to wonder whether these people should have gotten those student visas? Well, indeed, there was some information around, but it wasn't on the State Department database. And we found out about all this when Assistant Secretary of State for Consular Affairs, Mary Ryan, testified before Congress in October of 2001. When the Congress asked her those questions, why were those 19 hijackers given visas to come to the United States? And she told the Congress, she said, our database did not have anything negative about them. But the databases that did have some information about some of those guys were unavailable to the State Department because the CIA and the FBI refused to give the State Department access to those databases. And we will be missing other people unless we are given access to those databases. And that the Congress is going to have to order those agencies to cooperate with the United States, because she said, we, the State Department, have appealed to them endlessly, and they will not give us access to that database. So one would think, oh my goodness, now we have part of the answer to this. And so the Congress no doubt had hearings the next day and hauled in the CIA and the FBI and said, you guys, you better start handing over this information. Now one would think that that's what happened. Did you see those hearings on TV? No, because the hearings never happened. The Congress didn't call the FBI and CIA in. But wonder what happened to Mary Ryan. Here she's the one that spoke up as a government employee. She spoke up about how we can resolve some of the issues that affect our national security. She became the one federal employee that was fired over 9/11. She was the one that was fired. Colin Powell, Assistant Secretary of State, didn't even have the courtesy to call her into his office, and yet she was the third highest ranking career Foreign Service officer in the State Department. He didn't even call her into his office. He had the Director of Management call Mary in and say, you're going to have to be the fall person, because it looks like the State Department's the one that's taken the rap on this, not the CIA, not the FBI. It'll be the State Department, and you're the one that's going to take the rap for the State Department. Now that's how whistleblowers, and actually Mary she wasn't being, in her opinion, a whistleblower. She was just an employee who knew how to resolve an issue of great concern to our national security, and she gave it to an organization, the Congress, that she hoped would help effect this change. But it didn't happen. How about other people that had information about our national security? That one would think if they come forward with it, then no doubt they'll get a pat on the back. How about the young FBI contract translator by the name of Sibel Edmonds, and she's in the news right now. Sibel Edmonds had been hired right after 9/11 to help translate a large number of tapes that had been collected by the FBI, tapes in the Turkish language and Farsi, or the language of Iran. She was a specialist in those two languages, and so she got the job and started busily going through this backlog of tapes, and as she would send forward her translations, sometimes she'd get some of them back, and it turned out that these translations were being changed, and being changed by her supervisor in a way that totally misconstrued what was on those tapes. And so she went around her supervisor to the next level up to say, you know, I hate to say this, but it looks like my supervisor's changing the meaning of these tapes. And also, some of the people that are named on the tapes seem to have some connections with some people that are right here in the FBI. And I think you all ought to investigate this. Well, one would think she would be patted on the back and given an award for truth-telling. What happened to her?
Gag order.
Fired. That's right. She was fired. And she's been fighting that firing for the last 4 years. She's gone to court with them, with the FBI. The FBI has had finally their Inspector General, after 4 years of doing investigations, came out with an unclassified report that said the firing was unlawful. But what was on the tapes? Why was she so concerned about her supervisor changing the translations? Well, we never knew what was on the tapes because she was very careful when she was fighting the firing. She wasn't talking about what was on the tapes because it did have to do with national security. And she felt it was not appropriate to be giving that information out to the public, that she wanted to give it to the Congress. She wanted to let them know that there were things that were happening that she translated on those tapes that needed to be resolved. The Congress really didn't want to listen to her. And so for 4 years, she kept trying to give this information, and then finally at the end of last year, she decided she would go public with it. So she went to the major news media of our country to say, this is why I'm so concerned. Here's the story. But none of the media of the United States would touch it. She finally was put in touch with the London Times, the London Sunday Times, and they've now done 2 articles in January about the allegations that are on these tapes that senior U.S. government officials were selling nuclear information to agents from Turkey who were selling it on then to agents in Pakistan. And there were names that were on these tapes, names of senior officials. And Sibel said, I don't know really who these people are. I've never met them. It's not like I'm part of a vendetta against anyone. All I'm doing is translating the tapes, and this is what's on the tapes. Well, the Sunday and London Times did not just automatically publish what she was alleging. They did due diligence, and they contacted sources they had in the FBI and in the CIA to find out if these allegations that she was making in terms of what was on these tapes, did it make sense? Did it, or was it just poppycock? Well, their sources in both the CIA and FBI said, she's exactly right. There are ongoing investigations about this. Have you heard about the London Sunday Times articles? I mean, undoubtedly it was picked up by the New York Times and the Washington Post and all of the major newspapers of our country. No, it was just kind of like the Downing Street memos from 2005. The United States press is not covering it, and yet the only way we know about it is by Googling the Sunday London Times and then going on internet news services that are picking up those newspapers. So Sibel Edmonds she has now put herself in a position where the United States government may come after her to say you have disclosed classified information. And so what will happen to Sibel? Is she guilty of providing secrets to the enemy? Is she guilty of violating an Official Secrets Act? Well, the government will certainly try to say that and probably put a case against her. But all she was trying to do is to get the attention of our government, which would not listen, and to salvage her name, really. When you get fired from positions or when you speak out, you know, it's not an easy role. And very seldom do people come out of a position of being a whistleblower or resigning in protest over something that you don't have challenges with other people or people in the government that are questioning your integrity or challenging you on why it was that you resigned. And a person like Sibel, I mean, she is going to have some more very difficult times before all of this is over. But she has made public these allegations because she feels our government must stop. They must investigate what's going on in case these senior officials are still selling information to other countries. What about other people that in official secrets? You know, there was in Denmark. Denmark was a part of the Coalition of the Willing. Denmark joined up shortly after the war started, and that was despite, as it turns out, the advice of all of the intel analysts in the Danish government, the military analysts and civilian analysts who were taking the intelligence information that was given to them by NATO, which actually that was the intelligence the U.S. gave to NATO and then handed out to all the rest of the countries. And the intel analysts of Denmark looked at it and then made their assessment. And a young major by the name of Frank Gravel wrote one of the major assessments that was there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and the government of Denmark should not proceed with a war based on that theory, that there were weapons of mass destruction that were a threat to the international community, because there just were no weapons. But the Danish government, the Prime Minister, went ahead and involved Denmark into the Coalition of the Willing. And the Danish have had military folks that have been primarily logistics people in the Coalition of the Willing. But what if you were an analyst and you saw that your analysis was being ignored by your Prime Minister or your President? Do you have the right to say, I think the public of Denmark ought to know that we're being led down the primrose path by our Prime Minister, and he's been told there are no weapons of mass destruction, and yet he's gotten our country involved in a war? Well, that's exactly what Frank Gravel did. He said, the public of Denmark needs to know this. And so he took the assessment he wrote, and he classified it himself when he was writing it. But he took that classified assessment and he gave it to one of the Danish newspapers. And the Danish newspaper printed it. And it was big news in Denmark that the Prime Minister was ignoring all the advice of the intelligence community and had gotten Denmark into this war. So what happens to a person like Major Frank Gravel? Fired. Well, he was in the military, so he got court-martialed. That's right, court-martialed. He spent 6 months in jail and was dishonorably discharged from the Danish military. Yeah, for telling the truth. Other things that have happened. Gosh, you know, our country from Afghanistan onward, I mean, we've been involved in some pretty nefarious things with prisoners and detainees, and buying them, purchasing them from Afghanistan and Pakistan. 95% of the people that are in Guantanamo were purchased by the United States rather than being captured on the battlefield. And we paid up to $5,000 for the ones that were alleged to be senior Taliban and $25,000 for those alleged to be senior Al-Qaeda. Over 800 people were in Guantanamo. And gosh, we must have gotten such good information from them that a lot of them must be convicted by now. How many have been convicted out of Guantanamo? Actually, one, but it was a plea bargain. It wasn't a conviction, it was a plea bargain.
The Australian guy.
That's the Australian guy, David Hicks, that's right. And he's ended up spending another 9 months in jail, but not in Guantanamo, in Australia. And he's now been released. But part of his release is that he can't tell anyone what happened to him in Guantanamo. But what about all those other people, those other 799? How many are going to be eventually prosecuted by the United States? The administration says maybe between 50 to 75. There now have been 4 that have been charged, including 2 teenagers, or they were teenagers when they committed their alleged offenses. When did we find out the names of the people in Guantanamo? You know, for the longest time we knew there were people there, but we didn't know their names. And then how can they be defended or offered some at least minimal help in determining whether or not the charges against them are reasonable or there's evidence for them? How can you do that when you don't even know their names? You don't know their nationalities. You know, for almost 2.5 years, we did not know the names of the people that were in there. And the only way we found out was because of a military officer, a Navy lieutenant commander by the name of Matthew Diaz. And he was one of the lawyers at Guantanamo. And he was wondering deep in his heart, how could this system that we're supposed to be defending, this great United States of America with one of the greatest legal systems in the world, and that legal system's just being undercut by what's going on in Guantanamo and other places. And it's just not right that these guys that are in this place, that people can't even know what their names are, and that groups like the Center for Constitutional Rights and law firms that were doing pro bono work, how can they do any work when they don't even know who these people are? So Matthew Diaz decided, well, I'll let them know. And he copied the list of the names of the detainees, the prisoners, and put it on a CD and mailed it to the Center for Constitutional Rights. Well, eventually, I guess it was probably because they probably lined up every American that was down in Guantanamo and said, did you give the names, did you give the names, did you give the names? Somehow they found out that it was Matthew Diaz that gave them the names. So what happened to Matthew?
Fired.
Fired. Court-martialed. Court-martialed. Yes, court-martialed, 6 months in jail, dishonorable discharge. And yet all he did was tell the truth, to let the names be known. And then how did we even find out, you know, those horrible pictures that came out of Abu Ghraib, the sexual humiliation, the torture of the men and women in Abu Ghraib, and those 29 photos that were on 60 Minutes and the article that Seymour Hersh wrote. How did that come about?
One person.
Who spilled the beans on the photos?
A soldier.
A soldier, yeah.
Yeah.
Yep, that's right. It was a guy by the name of Specialist Joe Darby, who was handed a CD filled with, well, was handed a CD by a Sergeant Grainer, whose job was he was in charge of one of the wings in Abu Ghraib prison. And Grainer came by Darby one day and said, "Hey, Darby, take a look at these photos. Now you'll be seeing what we do to those prisoners." And Darby took it and went to his computer and looked at it and was horrified about what he saw. All of these horrible things that were being done to those prisoners. So he took that CD and took it over to the Criminal Investigative Division of his unit and said, "You guys are the ones that are supposed to be watching out for criminal activity in our unit, and I think this may show evidence of some." And indeed, the CID was very concerned about what they saw, and they started moving that set of photos on up the chain of command. And word started leaking out, and Seymour Hersh started finding his sources, and 60 Minutes finally got a copy of it. And then, you know, the world knew what was going on. 29 photographs out of probably, I think it's 5,000 photographs that there are, plus videos that members of Congress who have seen these things have said these should never be seen by anyone else. They are so horrible. If they are made public throughout the world, that the wrath of the world will be horrendous on the United States. Well, at the point, though, we knew Seymour Hersh had written an article, 60 Minutes had written an article, and this was putting a lot of pressure on the Pentagon. And Donald Rumsfeld in a press conference was confronted one day about what's going on in Abu Ghraib. Why is all this horrible treatment, and what are you doing about it? And Donald Rumsfeld on international TV said, well, we do know that something has gone wrong there, and there are some bad apples there, and we have to thank for all of this Specialist Joe Darby. And he said it in a tone like, you know, yeah, Darby, thanks a lot. Well, on the TV in Abu Ghraib prison and the mess hall, Joe Darby saw that. He was sitting at the mess hall table with his buddies when the Secretary of Defense came on, and everybody started listening because, you know, never can tell what Rumsfeld's going to say. And Rumsfeld said, it's Joe Darby we have to thank for these photographs. Well, his buddies, many of whom were implicated in this criminal action, were sitting right there with him. And so the first thing, hey, Darby, thanks a lot. Yeah, squealing on us. Thanks, Darby, we'll get you. So Darby went to his commanding officer to say, it looks like the Secretary of Defense has named me as the person who has been responsible for the photographs being seen, and I think I may be in jeopardy. My life may be in jeopardy here. And the commanding officer said, yeah, I think it will be. And so they flew him out the next day, out of Iraq, but not to his home, because his family back in his home in West Virginia was already getting death threats from the neighbors whose family members were being identified through these photographs. So Joe Darby never went home. He's now part of the Federal Protection Service. He has a new identity. What about whistleblowers that are other ones that are in the military that may say, you know, I think this is an illegal war. It is an act of aggression, and I didn't join the military to commit a crime, an act of aggression. I do not want to be a part of war crimes, and thank you very much. I won't either go to Iraq or I won't go back to Iraq if I've already been there. I'm saying I won't do that. Do military have the right to do that? They're volunteers. I mean,
they're getting away with it, though, aren't they?
Well, not really. I mean, we've had 30 people who have said, I will not go back. And they've gone AWOL and then turned themselves in later, and they've been court-martialed. And they've received anywhere
dishonorable discharge.
1 month to 15 months in jail and dishonorable discharges. We've had hundreds, thousands of others that have been administratively discharged, getting a less than honorable discharge, but no prison time. And then we've got over 300 men and women in the military that are in Canada right now who have said, I should not be, I shouldn't have to go to jail. I'm not the one that's going to commit illegal acts. I'm just going to sit this one out, thank you very much. Well, you know, during the Vietnam War, over 50,000 U.S. servicemen and women went to Canada to wait it out, and ultimately were given their amnesty. Yeah. They applied for political asylum when they went into Canada, and the Canadian government gave it to them immediately. But these days, the Canadians do not give political asylum for U.S. servicemen and women. They have them apply for refugee status, and many of them have. The ones that have applied the longest time, their cases have now gone up to the Canadian Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has ruled that they are not eligible to be refugees. So now what happens to them? Are they going to be returned to the United States? Well, many members of the Canadian Parliament are very concerned about it, and so they're trying to sort this out. But in the meantime, should those men and women be returned to the United States? Amnesty International has stepped in and said, no, they should not. They should be called persons of conscience, and they should not be returned because the United States of America has a death penalty for deserters. That deserters can be executed, and they should not be returned to a country that murders people in that way. And also the Canadian government has said that the Canadians have put the United States on its list of countries that torture. Now how about that? The United States of America is on the list of countries that torture. Because we do. Except that only stayed on the Canadian list for about 2 days, and then it was suddenly taken off.
Whose list was it?
The country of Canada.
No, but which department? Who made the list?
The Canadian government made the list. I don't know which part of the Canadian government, but it was, the United States was suddenly taken off 2 days later. And can you imagine the phone calls that were going between Washington and Ottawa about, you better get us off that list, you'd better get us off. But, I mean, do you return servicemen and women to a country that tortures people? And the Canadians know that for sure, because it was one of their citizens, Mahar Arar, who was taken from JFK Airport and sent to Syria, where he stayed for 7 months and was tortured there, and then finally returned to Canada, where the Canadians have paid him $10 million. The United States has not so much as said, we're sorry.
Why did the Canadians pay him money? They had no partner.
They were, I guess, well, I think the Canadian, Royal Canadian Mounted Police somehow had given some information to the U.S. And so when he was coming back from a trip to somewhere in the Middle East and stopped in JFK, rather than the U.S. saying, okay, he's your citizen, you've got some information on him, you investigate it, and you handle it. But no, this kidnapping that the United States has embarked on, this extraordinary rendition, we were picking up people all over the place, and apparently with a grin on our face. Oh, we got another one. Let's send him to Syria. Let's send that other one on to Egypt. Let's send people from Afghanistan. Let's send them to Uzbekistan, where they can be boiled. UK ambassador to Uzbekistan, Craig Murray, whom some of you all may know because he's come here to testify, to witness, to talk about now his book called Murder in Samarkand, that the United States was sending prisoners from Afghanistan up to the very horrible regime of Karimov in Uzbekistan, where torture is done every single day there. And Craig writes about talking with families who retrieved the bodies of their loved ones the bodies had been boiled. Well, so the torture that the United States is now known of, I mean, we do have an attorney general who cannot still determine whether or not waterboarding is torture, a vice president that says that waterboarding is just fine. We have a Congress that passes the Military Commissions Act that allows enhanced interrogation techniques, which can bring a person to the point of organ failure, and it's still not torture. So the rest of the world, I think, has our number pretty well on this torture. So there are a lot of people, and many of these are all of the people that I've mentioned. We profile in this book called Voices of Conscience. There are 25 profiles that we have of men and women of our government and of the British government, the Danish government, and the Australian government, who have in their own ways taken on the U.S. government and have, or their respective governments, and have spoken out at great risk to their careers. And to their personal freedoms, if you look at our military folks who have gone to jail for speaking out. So with that, I guess my plea is that we all have our voices of conscience. And for those of you all who are here, I know that you participate a lot in actions that are trying to hold accountable our government and trying to get us on a legal, correct path that will hopefully somehow undo some of the damages that have been done in the last 7 years. So I want to thank you all for what you do every single day, and to remind you that in March we do have the end of the 5th year of the war on Iraq. And there are lots of events that will be going on here in New York City and this area. But being so close to Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, I would appeal to you to take time during that week, particularly the 18th and 19th, to come to Washington and help put pressure on our government to stop this war in Iraq. Or if you can come the previous week, we have 3 days of what's called Stop Loss Congress. Don't let them leave Washington. Make them stay there as the U.S. military is having to stay in Iraq and Afghanistan past their terms of enlistment. We're saying stop the Congress. Don't let them go home for their Easter break. Keep them in Washington and make them face the realities of the end of the 5th year of the war in Iraq and the end of the 7th year of torture that's been going on in Guantanamo and other places. So we really do need lots of help, and there are lots of organizations here, Lori and Raging Grannies and World Can't Wait, and all sorts of organizations are here to provide actions that will be very, very important for the rest of our country to know that people are in the Capitol and we're trying to hold people accountable. And as equally important, that the rest of the world sees that Americans are not just sheep, that we have a lot of men and women and boys and girls that are standing up to stop these illegal actions of our country. So I thank you all very much for being here.
I said, sit down. Tell me about it.